All right, so we're on to the third video for Unit 6, and we're talking about chemical names now, specifically chemical names for molecular compounds. We talked about names for ionic compounds in the previous unit, and now molecular compounds. So every molecular compound has a specific scientific name, and it tells us about the composition of the molecule. So the chemical name tells us a couple of things. First off, it tells us the identity of the atoms in the compound, which is the same as in the previous unit with ionic compounds. We knew what atoms were involved. But there's a difference here. When we're talking about molecular compounds, it's also going to tell us about the quantity of each atom in the compound. So in this unit, we focus on something called a binary molecule. And these are molecules that are composed of two different elements. I have a note here. Please don't confuse the terms diatomic and binary. So a diatomic molecule is composed of two atoms of the same element. Remember, we had 7 of them. There was, for instance, O2, Cl2, and I've got a more exhaustive list on the first page that you can go back and look at. A binary molecule is different. It's composed of two different elements, and it may contain more than 2 atoms. So some examples of binary molecules would be carbon dioxide, CH4. They have 2 different elements. So when we want to figure out the name of a molecular compound, we usually start with the chemical formula. The element named first in the chemical formula is first in the name. Just like in previous chapters, we don't want to change the order. The element named second in the formula is going to be second in the name. And the name of the second element will change just a little bit. The ending is dropped and the suffix IDE is added. And so that's a lot like what we found in the previous unit. The chemical name is also going to give us more information this time around. It includes how many of each atom are present in the molecule. To do this, we're going to use prefixes. So here are the prefixes for binary molecules. When we have one of a given molecule, its prefix will be mono. When we have 2 of them, its prefix will be di. 3 is tri. 4 is represented by tetra. 5 is penta. 6 is hexa. 7 is hepta. 8 octa. 9 nona. And 10 deca. Some of these prefixes are shared with math. So like penta, hexa, so pentagon, hexagon, octagon, nona, deca. But some of these are a little bit unique. For instance, tetra is not a math term. In math, it would be quad. In chemistry, it's tetra. So we've got a couple of issues here. So for the most part, these rules are going to be used. We have 2 elements. Each one has a prefix that tells us how many of that atom is present. But the prefix mono does not always follow the rules. So when the first element in the name has only one atom in the compound, mono is omitted. We're going to leave it out. So an example of this one might be carbon dioxide. There's only one carbon, but we're not going to call it monocarbon dioxide. It's just carbon dioxide. The next thing about it, if mono is added to oxygen, one of the O's is left off just for the sake of pronunciation. So a molecule with the formula CO, there's one carbon, which would be mono, but it's the first element, so we don't put the mono. Here is one carbon. The second element is oxygen, and there's only one, so the prefix mono. And remember, the ending of the second word changes. It's going to be oxide, monoxide. So some examples of the naming system. We have CO2. So there's one carbon. We're going to leave off the mono. And we have two oxygens. 2 is represented by the prefix di, and then oxide. This one is C2H6. We see that it has 2 carbons, so we call it dicarbon. And here's a 6-hexa. And hydrogen is a little bit weird. It becomes hydride, hexahydride. Here's C2H4, 2 carbons. There's di-carbon, and 4 is tetrahydride. We've got more, so P2O4 would be 2 phosphoruses is diphosphorus. And 4 is tetraoxide. S2F10, we have 2 sulfurs. Disulfur. 10 is decafluoride. So this is just some examples for our naming system. Here's a couple others. So let me give you one here. C3H8. And under our naming system, we can give it a specific name. Now, if you were to Google this, and let me write this in a different color. So using Google will tell you that this is propane. Propane is the real chemical name in the organic chemistry naming. But this is not the naming system that we use. So what we would call this, there is 3 carbons. So tricarbon. And there are 8 of these hydrogens. So So we would call it tricarbon octahydride. If you Google this, it's probably not going to give you this chemical name. And so you want to be careful. And I don't know how many people out there are just Googling their homework questions, but I know it happens sometimes. So if you Google it, it's going to give you an entirely wrong name. And so just be careful. A lot of molecular compounds have common names. And these are the things that we would call them just in the regular world. Things like ammonia and water. So they also have scientific names. But the common names are used because they're familiar. These compounds were named and discovered well before this system was invented. In fact, the common names of a lot of molecules will predate the discovery of atoms or molecules, and they go back way further than really any organized chemistry in general.